Hi, everyone, and welcome. I need to get set up here. It's November 1st. This is the second to the last class. Next week will be our last fall quarter class. Thomas Jefferson will be continued winter quarter beginning in January. So thank you. First thing we'll talk about is the amount of support among colonists for the American Revolution. And then John Meacham, famous historian, wrote a book on Jefferson. We'll talk about his attitudes toward Jefferson. And there was a question about the Welsh language origin that stemmed from Jefferson's ancestry, which came out of Wales in England. So different sides in the revolution, the war for independence, as I like to call it, and how many people supported. It was John Adams that had the 1/3 rule. Excuse me for just a second. I want to turn on a fan here. Thank you. John Adams said 1/3 of all colonists support England. 1/3 don't care, and 1/3 support the revolution itself. People have gone back and looked at this in the present day, tried to come to some conclusions. Lots of textbooks and scholars now state there was about a 40% support for the United States among the colonists. Some say 40+%. The Tories, who were British supporters, is now down to about 20% when compared to Adams's 1/3 rule. Patriots, they intimidated the neutrals, wanted them to side more with England. Protestants in the United States who had come out of Scotland and Ireland, especially Presbyterians, willingly joined the "we support the revolution" fold, but at first wondered, and these Scots and Irish didn't much like England anyway. Now we're going to take a look at some other sources. This is what textbooks generally say. And that 40+% rule, that's a ranking that comes near the end of the revolution. People started streaming more toward support for the colonists. No more than 45% of colonists ever supported the war. At least a third of them fought for the British at the highest. And this 45%, again, that's near the end of the war. People were starting to migrate to who they saw as a winner. And the US, of course, was indeed winning. This is research done by the University of Rochester in New York State. And I don't expect you to be able to copy that website at the bottom, but that's their website where they talk about this issue. Americana Corner, that's another group that does research on American history. They talk about recent years, lots of detailed studies, attempts to understand how many people supported the revolution, how many people stuck with England, how many people didn't care. These people have found that about 20% of the population, which was about 400,000 people in the colonies, remained loyal to Britain. So that's down from the Adams admonition, about 1/3 each. Patriots, these are people who supported the American Revolution. The Americana Corner says that was about 40% of the population, up from 33%, as Adams stated. So that's about a 7% increase. U.S. history, that's United States history, that's another website. Their address is at the bottom of the screen. Similar finding, 20% of colonists remained loyal to Great Britain and to King George. This is about half the numbers that were dedicated to the American cause. No alternative but independence for the patriots. These fence sitters are often overlooked. About 80,000 of them fled up into Canada or moved to Britain, either where they had come from or where some of their ancestors had come from, just to escape the war that was going on, even though there was closer to about 800,000 of these people. About 10% of them actually fled the country. George Washington University contends that only about 1/3 of Americans supported the American Revolution. Almost everybody else has been saying it's up around 40%. The graphic here is George Washington University, located in Washington, D.C. So here's some facts, or sort of facts. Adams used the 1/3 rule, and he was a founding father, supporter of the revolution. Most of the research that's been done today, the modern day stuff, says about 40% supported the revolution. It was never a majority number, 50% plus one or higher. About 20% remained loyal to England, 40% took no side. So as I stated during the lecture last week, there were no polls, of course, in the 1770s and early 80s when the revolution was occurring. Much of the support for the revolution centered around New England, which is pictured here in the graphic. You can see it's made up of these states: Connecticut, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Vermont and Maine became states, and the people living in those areas were supportive of the revolution. In Pennsylvania, there was not a great deal of support for the revolution. There were people that were opposed to all warfare. By and large, Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, was a Quaker state, and Quakers are, to this day, most probably are conscientious objectors, and they've been opposed to warfare. Slaves in the United States, located throughout the southern U.S., supported England in the war because England was talking about not liking slavery. They took a while before they got rid of it, but they loved to have slaves come over to their side and fight in their war, and offered them freedom if they would do so. Next is Meacham's book, pictured here. It's available. You can buy it online or in bookstores. Won a Pulitzer. Meacham has won a Pulitzer Prize. There's a picture of him there on the right. Frequently, I see him interviewed on TV, especially the big, the 24-hour news stations, and anytime that there's a historical question. I don't use current books on presidents when I write these lectures. It's about history. Occasionally, I'll refer to a current book. I figure a great many people have read these books, but I have about 100 books on the president, of course, on presidents that I can look information up in. But of course, going online is a giant amount of information. So, and there's 7 major things that Meacham talks about in his book concerning Jefferson. And so I'm going to roll over those for you. First, he was both a philosopher and a politician. That's very unusual. Usually people that are interested in the presidency or in national politics, even local politics, they're politicians, deal makers, compromisers, etc. And they don't have a background in philosophy. Few people do today. If you got an education back in the 17 or 1800s, you took philosophy courses. So Jefferson was a philosopher and a politician. That's a main point that Meacham makes. Also, Jefferson was non-confrontational, according to Meacham. I suspect that this was in large part due to his stutter. Consequently, it was difficult for him to speak in public. He would speak among a few friends and so on. He had lots of social events, small groups of people, dinners, brandy, dancing probably. Port parties were another famous drink to have. Portuguese comes out of Portugal near the city of Oporto, and that's where the name for the drink comes from. It's really a fortified wine, meaning if you ferment grapes, they can get up to about 16% alcohol. You add another 4% by adding brandy, and those are fortified wines. Port is such a wine. But at any rate, Jefferson, non-confrontational. That can be important in politics. He can get people talking to him from either side, although that really wasn't the case at this time. There was a lot of disagreement between Adams and Hamilton and Washington and Jefferson and Madison on the other side. Thirdly, Meacham's very supportive in this book of Jefferson. He likes everything that Jefferson does. Many historians talk about Jefferson as being politically overrated. I have a section that will talk about Winter Quarter on Jefferson and his critics who contend that he's overrated politically. I think I've got about 8 items that are considered major political errors by Jefferson. Overall, as a person, very broad thinker, great inventor, architect, all sorts of wonderful things. We remember him today widely. His name's in everyone's head, but generally, and I agree with this, he's overrated politically. Jefferson was a giant supporter of rights and liberties. Jefferson, one of the big issues with the United States Constitution is that really didn't have any rights in it. A lot of people were upset about that. The body of the Constitution doesn't list rights. So the people that wrote the Constitution said, well, we'll add amendments. Well, the concern then was amendments can be changed. But the fact is, the first 10 amendments talk about rights and liberties. And Jefferson was a supporter of that, even though he was very much opposed to the U.S. Constitution because it had a strong federal government associated with it, which he felt would end slavery. Giant supporter of education. He was a founder of the University of Virginia, portion of it pictured here, with the buildings that were designed by Jefferson. So this is the older part of the University of Virginia, where he was the founder and the chief architect. And you can see the styles, especially on the building in the front there. Pillars, stairways, domed, round building. Sixth, lots of supporters for Jefferson among later presidents. And Meacham talks about Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt, Harry Truman, pictured here, John F. Kennedy, Ronald Reagan, all making frequent references to Jefferson. Wielded power, a lot of power, did a lot of things, some things that are questionable from the point of view of who's in control, the legislative branch or the executive branch. Jefferson reached out and purchased a gigantic chunk of property, the Louisiana Purchase, and he wanted less federal government. Meacham talks about these things and says these are great examples of the wielding of power by Jefferson. Welsh language origin was another item that came up due to Jefferson's ancestry, which came out of Wales. And Wales here, you can see, is in the western portion of England. London's way over to the east, straight across from Wales there. And you can see the St. George's Channel, it's called. And on the left of the map is Ireland. And the north part in green, all those green sections are big parks within Wales. That north section that includes an area called Snowdonia National Park is where ancestors of Jefferson's came from. What about this Welsh language origins? One of the oldest languages in all of Europe. It evolved from Brittonic or Brittonic. That means British. So the British language became, for many years, it was the main language not only in Wales, but in England and in southern Scotland. This was true and is reported by the Romans, who arrived in England and conquered most of England in 43 AD. So here we are just 43 AD, and the Romans have lots of records about this language known as Welsh being spoken widely there. Became a distinctive language confined more to Wales itself between 400 and 700 AD. So that's, 1,400 years ago or so, and it was established as a major language within the area that today we know as Wales. There's been several laws over the last 600 years to try to maintain the Welsh language. People would prefer to have them speaking English since they're a part of England. There were several laws that wanted to rid Welsh from the languages of England. beginning under Henry VIII, and that's about 600 years ago, early 1500s. He was king. He wanted English spoken in Wales and had laws passed, proclamations made. You can't talk that crap. The Samariac 2050 strategy. This is a Welsh declaration, a law. It was passed in 2017, and by 2050, the area of Wales wants at least 1 million people speaking Welsh within their territory. Current population of Wales is 3.1 million. So that would be, assuming the population stays the same, about a third of the people. By 2050, it'd probably be a fourth of the people or less that would be speaking Welsh. So there are efforts, just as there are in this country, to maintain Native American languages. There are efforts in Wales to maintain the Welsh language. And here's a sign in Wales. You can see it's quite a different language. They have some long words too. Okay, Jefferson lecture, finally. I've got slides ready today from 460 to 642. That's 180 slides. Usually I get through about 120. So I think we'll certainly get through 100 a day. Let's see how we do. And you can see the numbers of the slides there in the bottom center. This is a 27th slide today. We're going to start by talking about Jefferson as the minister to France. And he's done with his ministry there. He actually ministers an assistant to the ambassador, and he was an assistant to Benjamin Franklin, who was the ambassador. Franklin resigned. Jefferson then became ambassador to France. But he's heading back to the United States now. And here's what the United States looks like at that time. You can see a chunk of northern Maine in the upper right there is claimed by Britain, who owns Canada, and it's claimed by the US also. And you can see all the green areas are the colonies. There's an orange area at the bottom, and Spain owns Florida. They own a portion of present-day Georgia and Alabama. And that little orange chunk there is claimed by both the US and Spain. So the United States has unspecified borders both in the north and in the south. Then in the blue, we have territories. Southwest Territory, you can see, is present-day Kentucky, Tennessee area. And then the Northwest Territory that surrounds the Great Lakes and south and west of the Great Lakes. So let's talk about what Jefferson's coming back to. 5 years in France, 1785 to 1789. He goes, okay, I'm going back to the United States. I'm only staying there for a short while. Then I'll be heading back to France. He really liked the culture of France. He liked things that they had there, wine in particular. So Jefferson has no intention of staying in the United States. He's just back for a trip, make contacts, and then off to France again. But he gets off the boat and he finds out George Washington has appointed him Secretary of State. Jefferson then becomes trapped in the US, a place that he feels has very few cultural benefits. So he's Secretary of State. Let's talk about how it happened briefly, the appointment. He gets off the boat from France. People start telling him, you've been appointed by President Washington to be Secretary of State, and the Senate, who approves all ambassadors, has already approved of you. So you're the Secretary of State, and you got to stay here now. Now, nobody had asked Jefferson, Washington in particular, if he even wanted the job. And Jefferson goes to Washington and says, hey, I'm pretty uncertain about this. I have liked being in France. I don't know that this is the job for me. Washington starts telling him, hey, you were a minister in France. You were an ambassador to France. You negotiated treaties with other European countries. This is what the Secretary of State does. You're well equipped for this job. So Washington had to convince Jefferson, which he was able to do. Issues during Jefferson's period of time as Secretary of State. He took office on the 22nd of March of 1790, and he resigned from the office on the 31st of December, 1793. Washington left office 1797. So this is pretty much through the first term of George Washington. Washington left office in 1797. Jefferson was Secretary of State for 3.78 years. And I've got a list of time here. That's over 45 months, 1,380 days, 33,000 hours, 2 million minutes, over 119 million seconds, if you can count fast. And I've got a clock on the right. You know, every time I go see a doctor anymore, they want to know if I'm mentally acute or not. And they say, here's a sheet of paper. I want you to put all the numbers on the clock in a circle as they appear on the clock. And of course, they're not showing you a clock. And when you're done with that, they go, okay, now set the time at 10 minutes past 10 o'clock. So you draw in the hands, and then they can tell you if you're mentally acute or not. So anyhow, I looked all over for a clock that said 10 minutes after 10, and I found one. 8 major issues that confronted Jefferson in his 3 years and 7 months in office as Secretary of State. 8 issues, and behind the 8 ball, so to speak. First, there were conflicts. Jefferson was opposed to a strong federal government. I'll repeat this many times. The slave owners were very concerned that a strong federal government would mean the end of slavery. The rest of Washington's cabinet, including Washington himself, wanted a strong federal government. They became known as Federalists because they wanted a strong federal government. They included Washington. You know, we tend to depict Washington as this guy who didn't take sides. That's really not true. He was very much in favor of a strong central government. Jefferson wanted it weak. So that was a conflict. Jefferson, as Secretary of State, stood alone in the Washington cabinet with other cabinet members concerning a strong federal government. The major opponent was the Secretary of the Treasury on this issue of how strong the federal government could be, and that was Alexander Hamilton, pictured here. That's not this guy. He played Hamilton on Broadway. The sale of Hamilton books increased dramatically because of this Broadway play. Conflicts, again, can't repeat it often enough. Southern people supporting, especially Southern aristocracy, supporting a weak federal government. A strong one would become very difficult for slavery. And Jefferson was, a very large slave owner. So strong federal government, large slave owners were opposed. Here's a picture of Joshua John Ward. He lived to be 52 years old from 1800 to 1853. His nickname was King of the Rice Planters. He grew rice in South Carolina. He had been lieutenant governor of South Carolina, so he was involved in politics also. In 1850, 3 years before he died, he owned 1,092 slaves. When he died, left those slaves to a son. In 1860, there were 1,131 slaves owned in what had been his group of slaves. Thomas Jefferson owned 600 slaves, so about 500 less than this man, who was the all-time big slave owner. Foreign policy, item number 2 of the 8 that we're going to look at, issues that Jefferson faced as Secretary of State. He supported France. Most of the cabinet supported England. Jefferson loved France. He said, hey, they got rid of a king like we did. I mean, they killed their king. We didn't kill the British king, but we got rid of a monarchy in these colonies. And France, they sent us one of their leading military experts, the Marquis de Lafayette, to aid us in our fight against Britain. And they supported us. They had their navy blocking U.S. ports. They blocked the port at Yorktown, the French did. That was the decisive battle of the war. The British couldn't escape from a huge number of troops that had them trapped in Yorktown. They couldn't escape by sea because of the French Navy there. And they ended up having to surrender to the American rebels. So France supported our revolution in numbers, in offers of expertise, in shipping or ships. We should be supporting France. And this whole cabinet here is supporting England for economic reasons. So Hamilton, again, was the major outspoken person on this issue in opposition to Jefferson. Wanted strong ties with Britain, Hamilton did. Here's a picture of Britain controlling northern portions of Ireland today. This is a modern map. At the time of the American Revolution, England supported all of Ireland, or didn't support it, they conquered it. Interesting thing, too, was it was under Queen Elizabeth I that Ireland got conquered. And the order she put out was, anytime you see anybody with a musical instrument, her order to her soldiers was, kill them. Because they were going from town to town singing against the British in bars, pubs, and places to eat, and open squares. And so we need to get rid of these people who are fomenting backlash against our conquest here. Foreign policy continued. Hamilton's arguments. The United States has British traditions. It doesn't have French traditions. We are, by and large, we're English speakers here. There's exceptions. Pennsylvania was speaking German and some Dutch. Good relationships with England will prevent us from another war with England, was another argument of Hamilton's. That didn't happen. The War of 1812 was another war with England. Many historians say the American Revolution was a war for independence. It was a political war. The War of 1812 was an economic war with England. It gave the U.S. greater trade rights than they had been able to negotiate with England. But one of Hamilton's arguments was, if we have good relationships with England, we won't have another war with them. Also, directly to our north is Canada. It's not an independent country. It's held by British. It is under British control, and it's close to the United States. The British have lots of troops there, and we want to side with their enemy, France. Not a good idea. Here is a photo, a painting rather, of Frederick Muhlenberg. Frederick Muhlenberg lived in Pennsylvania and was a German. And this involves foreign policy. Now, Hamilton wanted English to be an official language in the United States. This fellow, Frederick Muhlenberg, was the first Speaker of the House of Representatives and was a German. And he introduced a bill that German should be the official language of the United States. There's what I've got here. First Speaker of the House introduced a bill, German is official U.S. language. There it is in German. And another drawing of Muhlenberg. So Muhlenberg introduced this bill. German is going to be the official language of the United States. It failed by one vote. That's how close we came. Think of how that might have changed 20th century history. Think about World War II. At any rate, we have never approved an official language. We are a nation of multiple languages. It's frequently been said, we're not an English-speaking nation. We are a nation where you are allowed to speak English. Same thing has been said religiously. We are not a Christian nation. We are a nation where you are allowed to be a Christian. Third item, monarchy. Jefferson was a Democrat. They were called the Republican Democrats at that time. They dropped the term Republican. Their history is really of the Democratic Party. And Jefferson was a, hey, no king kind of guy. Federalists were talking about kings and monarchies and supporting them and liking them, and wanted royal treatment for the President of the United States. Under John Adams, you didn't shake hands. That happened with Jefferson. Jefferson started shaking hands with people who came to the White House. John Adams, you bow to John Adams. And he was addressed as Your Highness, not Mr. President. A federal bank was the fourth issue during the Secretary of Statehood of Jefferson. Hamilton favored a national bank owned and run by the U.S. government. Jefferson was opposed to this. Weak federal government is what he wanted. Hamilton's arguments were, there are debts from the American Revolution. Federal bank could control those debts, bring them all together from the various states that also had debts. They could, a federal bank like this, owned by the federal government, could get loans from private banks across the country to aid in the support of the federal government. Jefferson opposed this kind of power for the federal government. Hamilton, Washington's cabinet, with the exception of Jefferson, supported such a thing. Okay, Revolutionary War debt, one of the arguments Hamilton was using for a federally controlled bank. Hamilton and the Federalists wanted to assume all the state war debts. They said these states could end up having trouble. There could be fighting among the states. Some states supported more of the revolution than other states did. So this could really become a problem if we leave all these Revolutionary War debts in the hands of the states. So let's take on those debts ourselves. Jefferson and the Democratic Party felt that that would be a violation of states' rights. Now, it's interesting here because we think of the Democrats as being in favor of a strong federal government. Well, they changed their mind. Here in this period of history, they favor states' rights. It's later on, 100 years later, that they become supporters of a strong federal government. Again, Jefferson and the Southerners are worried about this federal government gaining power, and in this case, financial power, that this would threaten slavery. Item 6, capital city for the United States became an issue under Jefferson. We hadn't built a capital yet. There are several places that served as capitals for the United States, most famously New York City and Philadelphia. And there was concern about where should this capital city be if we built one, if we don't leave it in Philadelphia. And the argument became what it is in business, location, location, location. And why is location important? Well, the South wanted it in the South. It would give them more power. They could oversee the federal government easier and maybe control it better. Hamilton, most of Washington's cabinet, wanted it in New England. New England, the South was richer, but because of the agriculture. But New England knew more about financing. Hamilton said a capital for the United States belongs in a place where we know about finances between nations and within our own republic. North knows financing. Put the capital city in the North. Southerners said we want it in the South, hoping that their control over the capital would be less threatening to the abolition of slavery. The compromise that they came to was, okay, you can have a federal bank, but then this new capital you're going to build has to be in the South. So Hamilton and the cabinet got their federal bank that could get loans from private banks, could aid in the financial support of the federal government, and the South got the capital, Washington, D.C., built and located in the South, where they felt they could have some control over the federal government. British relations. Jefferson. He wanted the British out of U.S. territories. There were British forts around several of the Great Lakes, or at least a couple of them. Here's a blow-up of that map. Now, it's hard to see. There's a little box, such as you see at the bottom here, that indicate next to the name of a fort that it's controlled by the British. But they're hard to see, so I put a black arrow by each of them. And you can see they run from the state of New York down to Lake Ontario there, moving to your left, and to Lake Erie. And these forts with all the little black arrows pointing at them, boy, that's British people just way too close to us. They're even in some of our states. And look here. This was the proposed border for the United States and Canada running along here. Today, everything in orange is a part of Canada. There's a Canadian city down here that is further south than Detroit, Michigan. But in 1782, this was under negotiation as to where this border should be, and it ended up being much further to the south. Slavery, again, another issue. During the American Revolution, lots of slaves escaped to the British. The British were saying, hey, escape to us, we'll give you your freedom, even though they had slaves in Britain also. So the British Army was increased during the American Revolution because they allowed in and supported slaves who had escaped. The war is now over. Jefferson, as Secretary of State under George Washington, wants compensation for these slaves that the British encouraged to join their troops in exchange for their freedom. In other words, you stole property from us. Well, that compensation from the British never happened. There was compensation for a variety of things, and we'll talk about that later. So slaves escaping to the British Army, freed by the British, no such compensation. The British, now this is 1783, was the Treaty of Paris that ends the American Revolution with Britain. Britain is still a slave nation. They ended the slave trade in 1807, and they abolished slavery in 1838. But they'd been talking about it very seriously in the late 1700s also, when the United States wasn't talking about freeing slaves yet. Compromise of 1790. This is a major piece of legislation under Jefferson's term as Secretary of State. It's Jefferson again versus James Madison, who would become President of the United States, and Hamilton. Both were Democrats, or both were Federalists. Jefferson was the Democrat. The issue, again, National Bank versus the U.S. Capitol location. So let's talk a little bit more about this compromise, about you get a national bank you get the capital in the South. Hamilton got the bank, South got the capital. And that's what the Compromise of 1790 was about. Federal bank versus capital location. One of the most important agreements in U.S. history, according to many historians. There's a total of 3 of them, and they all deal with slavery. The Missouri Compromise of 1820. Every time a state comes into the Union and it's a free state, you have to allow a slave state in also. So we maintain a balance. You got 20 states, 10 have to be slave states, 10 have to be free states. And that maintains a balance in the United States Senate. You got 20 states, that's 40 senators, 20 of them are from slave states, 20 are from free states. The free states can't get any legislation passed as long as the slave states hold their votes together. Then the Compromise of 1850 came along, and this was California, separated from the rest of the United States. It wants to come into the Union, but where can we get a slave state? Well, it was decided California can come in as a free state, and then the Texas, which is already a slave state, will settle their border dispute. So we'll make them smaller. And that's what happened. Texas was claiming land that included portions of Oklahoma and up into the Southwest. So what happened was with the 1850 Compromise, California comes in as a free state. In exchange, the Texas border dispute gets settled. The Broadway play Hamilton deals with the Compromise of 1790. There's a song called "The Room Where It Happens," and that's about this compromise of 1790. Of 1790, that was the federal bank and the capital location. Okay, Federalists get a federal bank. Slave owners get a capital in the South. Here in orange is an outline of the territory of Washington, D.C., still called a territory to this day. And you can see to the left, the west of Washington, D.C., is the slave state of Virginia. And within the slave state of Maryland is the land that is set aside for Washington, D.C. So Virginia is a slave state, Maryland's a slave state, Washington, D.C., the new capital of the United States, is located within a slave state. Slavery was allowed in Washington, D.C. until 1863. It was banned by a presidential proclamation by Abraham Lincoln 2 years into the Civil War. Slave auctions were allowed in Washington, D.C. until 1850, and they stopped having slave auctions in the nation's capital in 1850. Outlawed slavery, 1863. Conflict. Here is a statue of Washington and Jefferson. And it's at the Washington and Jefferson College, which is located in Pennsylvania. So let's talk about the conflict. Washington wanted to fire Jefferson. He was the guy in the cabinet that wasn't supportive of a strong federal government. He wasn't supportive of England and trade with England. He wanted France to have all the glory of having supported the United States, and let's pay him back. And so Washington did not like Jefferson's stand on the issues. Well, Jefferson knows there's lots of trouble, so he simply says, okay, I'm going to resign. Problem gets solved. He doesn't have to be fired. He can just resign, which is what he did. Now, as Secretary of State, Jefferson started a newspaper where he wanted to get his ideas published, have the newspaper distributed around the country, hopefully. This is a picture of it from 1791, and it's called the National Gazette. I probably shouldn't have included "the" in the title. The heading on the paper is just National Gazette. That's a big deal to a lot of publishers. They go, be sure "the" is in the actual title of whatever it is you're talking about. If it isn't, don't put it there. So Jefferson and Madison founded this paper. Sorry, by the time I blow it up, it's so blurry it can't be read. But at any rate, there's a full page graphic of Jefferson and Madison's National Gazette, founded to spread their conservative views, which were in large part, ownership of slaves, weak federal government, and more. Well, they founded this National Gazette in response to a newspaper that Hamilton had founded called the Gazette of the United States. And again, the title is just Gazette of the United States, not the Gazette of the United States. This was in a day and age when newspapers actually had opinions. The whole of the paper is Hamilton's ideas about a strong federal government, or Washington's ideas, Jefferson's ideas for a weak federal government. So they had positions. Newspapers then became neutral. They said, we'll print the news the way we want it. Newspapers, when they had opinions, they started, their names became synonymous with what their opinions were politically. So you might have the Louisville Democrat, or you might have the Omaha Republican. My wife's from St. James, Minnesota. It's 40 miles west of Mankato. The name of their newspaper is the St. James Plain Dealer, indicating that they're not taking a side. They're going to give you the actual facts. And there were lots of newspapers with names like that that indicated what their position was. Same applied to TV. TV news was going to be fair, equal-minded. We're just going to tell the story. You can draw your own conclusions. It changed for TV under Ronald Reagan, who said, no, they ought to be able to have opinions also. And bang, Fox News came into being, for instance, and so did other 24-hour news channels with a variety of opinions. Quotes from the National Gazette. Here's the Washington administration. Numerous evils, pregnant with every mischief. This was Jefferson's newspaper. And I've got a graphic here that indicates a pregnancy. Anyway, numerous evils, pregnant with every mischief. One Washington's 61st birthday was celebrated in the National Gazette, which didn't like Washington, a Federalist. Their quote from that day was, "A forerunner of other monarchical vices." Secretary of State, what were some of the divisions? But we're not talking about math. Factions were a term that were used in the first few decades of our republic. And today we call them political parties. And there was lots of concern about factions. The major concern of founding fathers was that such a thing should never exist. No factions, meaning no political parties. But by the early 1800s, they'd gotten established, and of course, today are well established and have been for over 200 years now. Federalist Paper number 10, which was written by James Madison. Madison says factions must be avoided. We just can't have these strong, opinionated political parties like other countries do. Strong federal government versus states' rights was a major issue that centered around the creation of political parties or factions. We've already talked about Federalists versus Democrats, and Democrats wanting a weak federal government, Federalists wanting a strong one, etc. The issue really with factions, again, slavery. How do we handle slaves? And if you ever get rid of slavery, what then are we going to do about these minorities that will exist on our soil? So states' rights has almost always been the winner throughout American history. It's still an issue. We're still talking about it. We still have states saying, you have no right to do that within our borders. There's a couple exceptions where the federal government really took strong control. That was during the Great Depression of the 1930s. During that depression, there was things were done to aid corporations, things were done to aid people. Social Security started. We had a decade-long economic depression with employment rates in the 20th percentiles. And another time that the federal government really came to the fore and was allowed to was during the civil rights movement of the 1960s. Lots of legislation about it's okay for blacks to get an education. You have to allow them into your schools, into your colleges, etc. They get to vote, and there's no restrictions on voting. You can't charge a poll tax. You can't make them take a test in order to prove that they're intelligent enough to vote, and so on. Those are the two major areas in U.S. history where the federal government really came through very strong. Warfare also, generally speaking, but that comes and goes, it goes away, and then the federal government's supposed to back down again. We're seeing this today, contemporarily. Early 21st century examples, Ron DeSantis of Florida and Abbott in Texas. DeSantis had been a congressman, advocated for states' rights in Congress. He vetoed or voted for, he voted against aid to the state of New York when Hurricane Sandy hit it Then, as governor of Florida, he accepted federal aid when Florida was hit by Hurricane Ian. The other big issue in Florida now, today, with DeSantis as governor, is what can you teach in schools? And he doesn't want negative things being said about the abolition of, or about slavery is an issue. And he doesn't want negative things being said about how blacks were treated, especially during slavery. How are we doing for time? We're okay for time. We're going to take a look at Jefferson's private life. He has resigned as Secretary of State. He becomes vice president in 1797, president in 1801. But for this 4 to 5 year period, 1793 to 1797, he's in private life. Let's take a look at what happens when he's out of office. He's just some guy, not an ambassador, not president, he's not vice president, he's not Secretary of State. One of the things, he doesn't keep his mouth shut. It's actually his pen that isn't shut. He doesn't like to talk much because of his stutter, but he writes lots, gets letters sent around, gets them printed in newspapers about his continuing interest in politics. First thing that we're going to talk about is Jay's Treaty, and this was in 1794. Okay, who's John Jay? He's a founding father. He became the first Chief Justice of SCOTUS. That's the Supreme Court of the United States. So Jay supports England, Jefferson supports France. Jay wants treaties with England, better trade treaties, so on. And that's what Jay's Treaty of 1794 is about. Let's take a little break here and look at some other Otises. SCOTUS at the top. That's the Supreme Court of the United States. POTUS. That's the President of the United States. VPOTUS. That's the Vice President of the United States. Instead of writing all this out, newspapers can use these little shorties instead. COTUS. That's the Congress of the United States. FLOTUS. That's the First Lady of the United States. And these items were first developed as codes for telegraph senders. A lot easier to send the word POTUS or acronym POTUS rather than having to punch out the long and short keys. President of the United States. You can just say POTUS. And as a result of this, language changed because the telegraph wanted shorter things. So same things happen today. Newspapers can take up several pages less if they use the word through, THRU, leave out the OUGH part. And words change tremendously because of newspapers wanting to shorten the number of pages that they had by using shorter, lesser letters for words, etc. Today, this is being done by cell phones. And of course, LOL, that's lots of laughs. I only have to type in 3 keys. I don't have to type in lots of laughs. And you can look this up online. It's a fun thing to do. Look up cell phone shorthand. And there are hundreds of these things. Anyhow, interesting. Jay's Treaty, trade treaty. It was an agreement with Britain. Thomas Jefferson opposed to agreements with Britain. Here's a quote from Jefferson: "Every man has two countries, his own and France." So Jefferson, the French supporter, is opposed to Jay's Treaty. Now, a lot of treaties, they aren't forever. They have expiration dates. And then Congress, the Senate in particular, has to reenact them and set them up again, decide on a new expiration date. Jay's Treaty expired in 1805. Jefferson was president from 1801 to 1809. So when it expired, and because he was an opponent of England and a supporter of France, Jefferson refused to have this Jay's Treaty agreement with England renewed. Major provisions of the treaty. Just checking to see how many questions there are. Thanks. First, compensation. There were shipping losses during the Revolutionary War, and the United States wanted money for those. A lot of those losses were privately owned ships. The United States itself didn't own a great many ships. So the British paid $11.6 million in 1783. That's about $250 million in 2022. And that was compensation mostly for privately owned ships. Now, the United States, the British said, there are debts that the United States had with Britain before the war, and you quit paying them when we were at war. We want those to start up again. And that's 600,000 pounds worth of debts to our banks and our government here in Britain. So $106 million in 2022. Okay, you got $250 million that we got as compensation for the loss of ships. Then we owe them $106 million for pre-war debts. United States in the treaty gained $144 million in 2020 dollars, so was the net gain. Compensation, arbitration agreement. Arbitration is, we agree to talk about these things before we start shooting at each other. So instead of just getting angry and pulling out guns or lining up ships someplace, let's talk. That's what arbitration is about. This was the first such agreement within a treaty in world history. First major one, anyway. Also, Jay's Treaty, we want Britain to vacate forts that they have in U.S. territory. Now, this was agreed to in 1794. It was accomplished by 1796, 2 years after the treaty. Here's one of the forts in Ohio. It's on the Miami River. There's a side view of it and an aerial view at the bottom. And you can see it's set up so that you can view in all directions. Jay's Treaty, third item. Trade. When you trade with other countries, you agree to treat them well. And this is called most favorable nation status. So Britain is telling the United States, you are on our most favorable nations list, and we're going to allow you to trade. And the trade could be with England itself and with the Bahama Islands that are controlled by Britain. Here's a close-up of those Bahama Islands, and you can see they're close to the United States there, off the coast of Florida. Jamaica is one. Over here are the Cayman Islands. My wife spent, I think, about a week down there once. And here's Jamaica. Here's the rest of the British West Indies. Jay's Treaty, major provisions. Number 4 deals with Native Americans. Free passage for the United States through any British territory is guaranteed by Jay's Treaty. Of course, most of the territory that the United States was granted the right to pass through was actually Native American lands. And free trade between the two countries of Britain and the United States. Items that didn't get accomplished. Jay was anti-slavery, and he refused to ask Britain for compensation for slaves who had escaped from U.S. owners and gone to the British and served in their army. And we're not even going to ask for that kind of compensation because Jay didn't believe in slavery. And impressment. Impressment is where practiced mostly by the British. They get involved in a battle and 6 of the sailors on board their ship are killed. They need to replace those 6. So they find a U.S. privately owned ship sailing across the Atlantic Ocean. They stop it and say, we need 6 sailors. And we're going to take 6 of your people. Here they've got 3 tied up, walking them across a plank. They will replace the dead English soldiers. And Jay refused to ask that, hey, you stop impressment. We don't want you taking our privately held sailors or even our U.S. naval sailors, U.S. ships. You can't take the ship, you can't take the personnel, etc. And Jay did not talk about that with the treaty. I think this is a good spot to stop, and I'm going to stop sharing. Next time we'll start with the vice presidency of Thomas Jefferson a week from today. And
all right, so we can start with the questions. Couple relating back to the beginning of your presentation. How did they derive the percentages of support for the revolution?
There's nothing that's very scientific about any of this. You know, they looked at records, they looked at things that people were saying. There was lots of writing about this in diaries in each state. So they looked at written records, and it just, it's a toss-up kind of thing. But it's the most reasonable kind of conclusion that they could reach about support within the United States for who wanted to side with Britain, who wanted to side with the rebels, who didn't care, etc. And you had people like Adams who simply said 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. Then you got modern day scholars that are looking at it and say it's more like 40, 40, 20, not 33, 33, 33. Again, there's no scientific polls existed then. So
the next question is pretty interesting, but it's how can we say that Jefferson was a big supporter of civil liberties when he was at the same time a big supporter of slavery?
Yeah. He supported it for part of the population. He supported it for white folks, He supported it for people who owned property. He supported the rights for people that were over 21 years of age. He supported it for people who were males. You know, that's basically what it took to have these rights in the late 1700s, early 1800s. It was Andrew Jackson who expanded all of that, but not to slaves. Slavery still existed. Jackson was a supporter of slaves, but and also Jefferson did not support the Constitutional Convention, but his worry wasn't rights being granted. His worry was a strong federal government and the damage they might do to slavery. But yeah, I agree. It's a conflict, and it's a hypocrisy. It's I don't know how else to say it, I guess, but Jefferson was an advocate for human rights, as long as it included the kinds of people that, white, over 21, male, property owner. There were lots of limits placed on it.
Mm-hmm.
We have some limits today. We don't let somebody move into this country from another country and vote. They have to become a citizen first. We do not allow ex-felons who have served prison terms to vote in many states. There's talk about that now. Should the federal government declare that released felons, people that have served their time in prisons, should be allowed to vote, for instance? And so, yeah, it's. I agree. It's a difficult thing.
Yeah. And then going to the states' rights sort of conversation that was in your presentation, would you say that there is more of a leaning with, our senators and representatives now with states' rights prevailing over strong federal government support, or a mix, or one way or the other?
Well, I don't know. That'd be an easy thing, I think, to find out. But my guess would be there are lots of states' rights advocates in the Senate, but they're not a majority. The majority is people who want a federal government. And, there are people in the states who say federal laws should not apply here. Well, that was one of the first major Supreme Court decisions. I think it was Marbury versus Madison in the early 1800s. That, yeah, federal laws do apply in the states. And anyway, there's no. My position is states' rights is still an issue. We hear lots about it. They have won most of the decades in American history, I think, up to the present day. We outlawed slavery in 1865, forbade it, but recreated it and called it Jim Crow until the 1960s. So, yeah, no more to say about it, I guess.
Yeah. So how did slave owners in the revolutionary time and then early U.S. history, how did they justify practice?
Well, they justified it economically. They also justified it biblically. Slave, obey your master. Wife, obey your husband, for instance, in the Bible. Now, today in politics, we've pretty much, Christian nations have overridden that biblical remark. and we don't want to have slavery. But there were religious justifications, there were economic justifications, there were who would do this work if we couldn't enslave people. There aren't enough people. There were states that had more slaves. Mississippi had more slaves than it did free people, for instance. I'll talk about that at a later date. It may well be into winter quarter yet, but at any rate, that's how it was justified, and it was also justified kind of intellectually. Well, these people don't have feelings. They're not like white folks, and they just they don't have the same kind of thinking capacity that we do, and so it's foolish to try to educate them. So there were biological arguments or intelligence arguments that were made also. You make somebody into a subhuman, and then you're really not doing them any harm.
And we have time for one more question, and this is an interesting as well. And it asks, if you were teaching this course 40 years ago, do you think slavery would be a big portion of what's covered? I know, things have changed in recent history, and we're kind of talking more about the uncomfortable truths of America.
Yeah. Well, no, it wouldn't have been taught, especially across the South. Many in the South still don't want it taught. Ron DeSantis has said you can't say things about slavery in a Florida classroom. So it's still an argument. That's why I bring it up. It's a major factor in the life of Jefferson, and I don't think it can be repeated often enough. Although Ron DeSantis thinks it shouldn't be repeated at all. So do lots of people across the South. So do lots of people across the North. There's lots of ways to limit. I mean, you call the University of Minnesota and start complaining about something that's being taught, and they'll say, hey, sorry, hang up the phone. But you call the local school board, and they get very concerned. So in K-12 education, it can be a difficulty. Now, there are some universities, Macalester College started accepting Black applicants, and a major family who was donating to Macalester stopped the donations. This is in the 1970s. Anyway, it's very obviously still an issue. So I repeat the word as often as I can, especially when we're dealing with a guy who owns 600 slaves.